I think STEM leadership is about helping more people understand what's possible with science and technology. And for us, it's really important to have a very diverse group of people in any project, no matter what you're doing, because you get different points of view and you get different perspectives.
The way that you excite young people about science, in part, is how you educate them in the classroom. But there is no substitute for being able to get them out to a place like the New York Hall of Science, where they can touch, they can feel, they can see science working, and they can really capture some excitement.
There's nothing more important as a society than trying to put as many of our best minds as we could on this problem. And I would love to see some great young minds get into it and then have that feeling we changed millions and millions of lives. I don't think there's anything that could be more fulfilling or more important to society.
NYSA sits in one of the most diverse counties in the country. And when I walk the halls and I see the kids, it just warms my heart, because you see kids from every possible demographic. It is tapping into that creativity of the whole of humanity. It is that that makes NYSA so unique. And it is that should be the model on the national level.
Its distinct approach to STEM learning and engagement, design, make, play, is a pathway to opportunity for all, especially for young people who would otherwise not have access to a STEM education. Every child can change the world for the better. They just need to be inspired and empowered.
To all of you who have joined us today, welcome, and thank you for making time to listen to our two extraordinary guests. I'm Margaret Honey, the president and CEO of the New York Hall of Science. As you saw in the video we just played, NYSCI aspires to be a place where your ideas, your questions, and your creativity are valued. We want the young people who come to NYSCI to have ample opportunities to participate in making meaning in ways that are joyful and delightful. We also believe there's an important distinction between what we want and need from the enterprise of science and how we go about the process of learning to think scientifically. Understandably, we want certainty, facts, answers from science. We want it to be a discipline that helps us to make informed decisions about our health, our planet, and our futures. That said, inviting a young person to engage in the process of learning science is a fundamentally different experience. It's about opening up the discipline, about building connections to what you know and to a broader world of thought and ideas. And it's about creating experiences that invite you to be an active participant in the sense-making process. These are the aspirations that bring us to today's topic of happiness. The pandemic closed NYSCI's doors on March 14th of 2020. And as we began to think about how to use what we've affectionately taken to calling this gift of time, we began to consider an exhibit focused on investigations into happiness. Not only could this be a cathartic post-pandemic remedy, we imagined, but more importantly, we knew that we could create an approach to this broad and rich topic that would engender the practices we value in science learning. Happiness is a concept we're all familiar with, and also one where we can surface our own experiences and practices and begin to understand the connections between how something makes us feel and the underlying science that helps us to understand the common why behind those feelings. When we reopen our doors on July 1st, we will debut a new exhibition called The Happiness Experiment. Along the way, we've had the extraordinary pleasure of learning from individuals who have written about happiness and have been willing to share their work and ideas with us. And now we have an opportunity to share them with you. Mathieu Ricard, who after completing his PhD in cell genetics, moved to the Himalayan region where he has been living for the past 45 years. Mathieu is a Buddhist monk, a humanitarian, a photographer, and an international best-selling author and a prominent speaker on the world stage, celebrated at the World Economic Forum at Davos, at the United Nations, and at TED, where his talks on happiness and altruism have been viewed by over 7 million people. Among his many undertakings, Mathieu is an active member of the Mind Life Institute, an organization dedicated to broadening the understanding of how the mind works by exploring the intersection between contemplative traditions and contemporary scientific inquiry. As I read a number of Mathieu's publications and listened to his many compelling and moving talks, I was struck by the range of perspectives he invokes as he explores questions of human consequence. Mathieu opens up the world for people, and that is exactly what we aspire to do at our museum and in our newest exhibition, The Happiness Experiment. We are also thrilled to be joined today by Jad Abumrad, the founder and co-host of Radiolab. Jad is an award-winning investigative journalist who has long been committed to using science, philosophy, and ethics to explore issues that test our preconceived notions about how the world works. He has graciously be Mathieu's partner in conversation today. Jad and Mathieu, we are honored to have you with us today. And Jad, now I'm going to turn things over to you. And just a quick reminder to our guests, you can post questions at any time in the chat, and we'll do our best to get to them toward the end of the event. So Jad, please take things away, and thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. Thank you, everybody, for having us. Thank you, Mathieu, for agreeing to talk. Let's just jump in. So we're talking about happiness. Hopefully we'll embody happiness along the way as we talk. You've written so much about this over the years. So I thought maybe the place to begin could be, let's talk definitions, because as I was preparing for this interview, it occurred to me, I don't even know what happiness is. It's not that I'm depressive, although sometimes perhaps. It's a fuzzy word. Is happiness the same thing as joy? Is it possible to be happy and miserable at the same time? All of these questions, I think, swirl around the term, which is often left vague. So how would you define this?
You are not the only one to wonder what happiness is. You know, the French philosopher Henri Bergson said the great thinkers have left the concept of happiness in the vague so that everyone could define in their own terms. But if, as Aristotle said, is the goal of goals, I mean, we do everything for some better way of being or sort of flourishing in life, but flourishing in life or fulfillment is a goal in itself. So if we don't know what we're talking about, and it's one of the main goals of life, we are in trouble. It's like, you know, shooting on arrows on a target with blindfold. So that's why it is, I think, quite important to at least have an idea of what we are talking about. So you mentioned joy, but many people also think about pleasant sensation. So that's something that's not quite what we think about happiness. And we often have this superficial idea that happiness will be the best possible scenario, will be an endless succession of pleasant experiences. That's a recipe for exhaustion, not for happiness. And for very simple reasons, is that any sensation is bound to change. Something that is pleasant becomes neutral and then could be aversive the next moment. I'll just give the example of, you know, listening to the most beautiful music. You might listen 3 times if you are a fan, but 24 hours is a torture that was used as Guantanamo. Or taking a hot shower after walking in the snow, fabulous, but 24 hours in the hot shower is no good. So it's nothing wrong with pleasant sensation. It's better than unpleasant one, obviously. But that's not what we would call happiness. So now you mentioned joy. Yes, of course, joy is more like the flowers of happiness. It's the natural expression of happiness when the circumstances allow. But you jump of joy, you don't jump of happiness. Otherwise, you get quite tired if you are basically a happy person. So we're looking at all the definitions when I try to research that subject. I could draw a column and I have every single definition and its opposite among all the great thinkers. Anyway, we need to get to the what could be a healthy definition of happiness, I mean, useful one, so that we could work something on our own life. And rather than a sensation that is volatile, that is changing, that is out of control most of the time, we better define happiness as a way of being. And way of being, I mean by that, it comes with as a cluster of basic human qualities, which can be cultivated as skills, and which together, say, altruism, benevolence, compassion, resilience, inner freedom, inner peace, inner strength, all those qualities that when they have sort of reached their optimal point, that gives a way of being. And unlike pleasure, the more you experience it, the deeper and the more stable it gets. So you still have the ups and downs of life, the joy and sorrows, but it's more like your baseline, where the platform on which you come back after the ups and downs, which can be changed if you cultivate those basic qualities. So in fact, there's no happiness, no sort of areas in the brain, but there are things connected with resilience, things connected with emotional balance, things connected with compassion and so forth. So that can be cultivated, which is also another big point.
Yeah.
So that's, I think, the basic. And in a nutshell, we could say it's an exceptionally healthy state of mind that gives you the inner resources to deal with the ups and downs of life and keep your balance. And as you said, that could be compatible with sadness, because sadness is a natural thing when you feel like, grief, someone dear died, or you watch a massacre, but you keep compassion, you keep your courage, you see your sense of meaning and direction in life, all those that constitute sense of flourishing. The Greeks speak of eudaimonia, the Buddhists speak of sukha. So again, more like a way of being.
Interesting. So if I'm hearing you right, it sounds to me like you listed a series of attributes, a series of elements. It sounds to me, since I'm a very visual, have 8, 9 different variables that can exist at different levels, almost like a mixing board, and happiness is the mix. Would that be would that be a metaphor that works
so
for
as
you?
a photographer, I would do another metaphor.
Okay.
Is when you have the different colors of the spectrum together, you get a white light.
Okay.
So now mental toxins. Why? Because they are toxic to our happiness and the happiness of others. Hate is one of the strongest candidates for being toxic. It poisons everyone's life. Likewise, excessive greed, obsession, arrogance, lack of discernment, mental confusion, delusion, all those mental states are afflictive. So they actually undermine the sense of flourishing. So the whole idea is not just like, there's no magic bullet, there's no magic recipe, there's no 3 points in 3 weeks and secret of happiness. It's actually a whole life process of cultivating the wholesome qualities that contribute to flourishing, and somehow eroding gradually your tendency to malevolent anger, to arrogance, to jealousy. Replace them by rejoicing, by patience, by kindness, by having inner freedom, so you are not stuck with all your obsessions. So there's a whole process, and we should not underestimate the power of mind to be transformed.
So, okay, 2 questions for you. I'm going to give you a compound question. These metaphors are interesting to me, whether it's a mixing board or whether it's the spectrum of light that creates white light. Is it the same for everybody? That's one question for you. And the second question is, how do we nurture the conditions that would create all of the sort of things that you just went through?
Yes. So everybody, people like very much to be different. But the point is, if you say, I must love my defect as much as my quality, that makes me unique, that makes my personality. But I mean, if you are constantly nagged by jealousy or anger, give me a break. I mean, it's better. It would be much better off without that. If you make a seminar, a weekend seminar, say we guarantee that we'll be 100% more jealous and angry at the end, who is going to come? You know instinctively, okay, that's maybe. So maybe it's a way to say, okay, I cannot do anything about it, so I better reconcile myself with myself. That would be fine if everything was grave in stone. You better, take it easy rather than being constantly upset with yourself. But if change is possible, if you can bring those good qualities to the optimal state and slowly erode those who are toxic, then it becomes interesting. So now, can you do something about it? Well, is it for everyone? Yes. Why? Because we all have a mind, and we deal with it from morning till evening, and that mind can be our best friend or worst enemy. And that's precisely about what flourishing is about. Your mind could be a constant, source of suffering, torment, frustration, endless rumination, hopes and fears, like a hell. And that state of mind can easily override the outer condition. Of course, it's crucial to improve the outer condition, remedy to poverty, social justice, everything you want. Yes, 100%. Yet, if you can be miserable in a little paradise, we see, this guy is so rich and beautiful and famous, he has everything. How come I hear he's totally depressed? What's wrong with this guy? If I had all that, I would be happy. Well, simply, you can move in the super high, luxurious flat at the 100th floor of a skyscraper, and if you are depressed, all you are going to look for is a window from which to jump. And conversely, if you have this inner freedom, this inner strength, these inner resources, you can maintain your joie de vivre, even in the face of adversity. You see that all the time. So outer conditions are important, but our control upon them is limited. It's often illusory and temporary. So while we can, if you change the way we experience the world, then our world changes, because in seeing everything gray, we'll see it differently. So it's not just to put a silver lining, it's simply to have the inner resources to go about in life. And one consequence is, if you don't have that, and if you feel so vulnerable, then you are so obsessed with yourself. How do I feel? What's going to happen to me? Do I gain or do I lose? Why me? Why not me? If you have this inner confidence, this inner freedom, then naturally you look around and you open up to others as well, because you are not so concerned with yourself all the time.
Speaking of, you mentioned change. I'd like to pick up on that and talk specifically about your journey, and then maybe we can return to some of these questions about nurturing happiness, particularly at this moment when things are quite fraught on so many levels. But as was mentioned in the introduction, you began as a molecular biologist. This was a lifetime ago. But you were very firmly entrenched in the world of research science, and then you made a break, and you went to the Himalayas, as it were. Can you talk me through that change? Like what was happening for you that made you want to do that?
For me, it was not a break. It was just like crossing a mountain pass and discovering another beautiful valley. So anyway, why? Well, first of all, science gave me an extraordinary taste for rigor. I can't stand those fuzzy things and all this fake news and things like that. These days is like appalling. So that's really what I learned from my boss in science, and I kept that as preciously throughout my life. One thing I may say is, when I was a teenager, I was fortunate to be, with a philosopher father, and my mother is an artist. My uncle was an explorer. He went around the world on a sailboat without engine in 1950s. And my boss, of course, was Nobel Prize of Medicine. I was, I'm very much involved in classical music. I was lucky enough at 16 to meet with Igor Stravinsky. So all kinds of wonderful people. But it was very puzzling at the same time. Because, I could take 100 gardeners, 100 scientists, 100 philosophers, 100 anything, and there was the same mix of wonderful people and people who were very difficult to be with, kind of sometimes mean. So there was no correlation between a particular skill or genius as a pianist, a scientist, philosopher, or gardener, and being a good human being. So if you look for a role model, I was really at loss. So I wanted their skills, but not necessarily to become like what they were. So then when I was 20, as I entered Pasteur Institute and did 6 years of research to do my PhD, the same time I traveled to India, having seen some documentaries about all the great Tibetan teachers who had left Tibet following the communist invasion of Tibet. And when I saw these documentaries, I thought, wow, here are 20 Socrates, 20 St. Francis of Assisi live today. I'm going. So I went there and met some of those great teachers, especially one, Kangyo Rinpoche. And there it was quite the opposite. I didn't know much about Buddhism. And it was not that interested me first, but here I saw a human being that was the best I could imagine of a very exceptionally good human being from all aspects. So I thought, whoa, if I could become even a little bit like this person, that would be great. So of course, 20 is very different culture, very different world. So I went back and forth 7 times while doing my PhD. Every summer I would rush there to Darjeeling in India. And over time, over those six years, I really grew the aspiration to go and spend time with my teacher for good. So I left, I did my postdoc in the Himalayas. And so I had a wonderful teacher. Then he passed away, and I had a second teacher where I spent 13 years. I did 5 years of solitary retreats up and down, sometimes a few months, sometimes a year. Wow. And so really, I feel so fortunate that I could meet all those teachers, get the teaching, try to practice. Then I became interpreter for the Dalai Lama. So I feel very blessed that I had this wonderful life. Now I'm 75, and I could have done better, more determination, more everything, but at least wonderful. Yes, I'm so happy to have gone through all that.
I'm fascinated by the movement between, as you say, you were going back and forth, and then eventually you stayed. When you were moving between, was it the similar mind state? Where because the life of a scientist, I am the product of 2 scientists. I grew up in labs. I know what it's like to be in a lab. It's a very solitary, very rigorous, precise endeavor. And then you go away from that to the Himalayas. I'm curious, did it feel like a break from one to the other, or did it feel continuous to you?
It felt like a marvelous adventure. Anyway, what is science about? Science is about finding reality as it is, isn't it? And, in Buddhism, one of the main goals of Buddhist approach is to bridge the gap between appearance and reality. We think people believe that things are more or less permanent. They are not. People think that things are autonomous and sort of independent. No, they are interdependent and so forth. So this is one aspect, but also, in terms of what enthuses you in life. So of course, doing research on the cell division of E. coli, which is a kind of bacteria, and mapping the genes of cell division of the chromosome, I was lucky to find things quite early, so I could wrap up my PhD pretty quickly. It was great. But then when I thought, well, something that can give meaning to my whole life at every moment, that's another type of research that I just would like to continue. So I was going to move to do a postdoc in the States, and my boss, François Jacob, was changing fields from bacteria to cell culture. So I thought, okay, that's the good time. I published the papers of my research. A chapter was closed, and I thought that's the good time to leave without making too much waves. And then I felt so happy. I didn't come back for 7 years first, and then I came back a few times. So yes, so I think I never felt I was between 2 chairs or in so completely contradictory worlds. It was just a further exploration. The domain of exploration changed from, going from delusion to knowledge and wisdom, from suffering to try to remedy to the cause of suffering. In a way, it's a science of mind. It's a science of transformation. It's a science of trying to become a good human being. So it's not something goofy. You're not just sitting under a mango tree with an incense stick and try to empty your mind, and singing IMSS or something.
Yeah. But perhaps I could ask you the question in a slightly different way. I mean, as you were moving from your science beginnings to what came next, what, and you spoke to this a bit earlier, what of your science work did you decide to take with you, and what did you decide to leave behind?
Well, I think basically most of it, except the details of working on bacteria, but I took the idea of inquisitive mind, of no-nonsense approach, very empirical and pragmatic. You know, Buddhism is not based on dogma, it's based on the science of mind and investigating the causes of suffering, how we can remedy to the cause of suffering. Is it possible at all? What's the way to do that? So it's extremely practical. And you know, when I then discovered the text and the philosophical aspect of Buddhism, I was even more enthused, because you have treatises on perception, 200 pages that date from the 1st century after Christ, you know, of common area. It's amazing. You have a deconstruction of the idea of indivisible particle, which are much more sophisticated than, you know, the Greek did with the hooked atom, like Democritus and all that. So much more interesting in logic. So, and we have logic about refuting the idea of a first cause. So there's a vast system of pramana, which is called logic, which is called valid knowledge, which is very elaborated. So when I got into also the philosophical side, I felt like it was incredibly profound and rich, you know. So, I mean, on all sides, both the inspiration of the living example of a teacher, the inner contemplative practice of trying to change and become a better person, and the intellectual richness of the philosophical treasure that I found there. I mean, it was extremely fulfilling.
Let me pick up on a word you just used, suffering. So let's getting back to the current moment, really. The Buddha says all life is suffering. So what does that mean for us to be happy, especially now? I mean, I asked that because of the reality that we're all living through right now. This year, these last 2 years have been, I hate the word traumatic, but it's the only word that I can think of that seems right. We are all so acutely aware of suffering on so many levels, in so many spheres of life. It almost feels like it is now the amniotic fluid that we're all swimming through constantly. It's just all around us. How do we pursue happiness when we're so aware of the suffering that is outside of us? What simple habits can we do?
The Buddha spoke about suffering, but he didn't say whole life was suffering, that's forever, that's our condition. He simply said, you know, if you go to a hospital, you see there are sufferings. So it's just a diagnosis. But and if it was just that would be completely uninteresting. You know, we don't need the Buddha to tell us that, you know, death is suffering, that the toothache is suffering, that anything. So the point is, suffering do not come just like out of the blue. They were not imposed on by some outer entity, at least that's the Buddhist view. They are a result of causes and conditions. And so if we identify those, then we can try to remedy. And the Buddha said the only point of his teaching is that there's a way out. Otherwise, as the Dalai Lama said, you better take a good beer and go to the beach and never think about suffering, because you are compounding suffering with worry. But if there's a way out, then suppose you find you have a sickness, it's much better to consult a doctor and follow a treatment. So that was the idea. Now, in our times, I mean, all this is pretty relevant. I mean, recently we had a webinar with the Dalai Lama on our common humanity in time of uncertainty. So all those qualities that we spoke about flourishing, they are all the more necessary now. Solidarity, a sense of oneness of humanity, oneness with the 8 other million species that are co-citizens in this world, our environment, that's the only one we have in this planet. So all these things are interdependent. And so forth. So there is all needs to be closer to each other. And yes, it is tragic, but I was struck when we did this webinar with the Dalai Lama. There was a Danish scientist, social scientist, who did 1,600 interviews, in-depth interviews from all over the world and people under lockdown. were 16% had very tragic and difficult experience. Either they suffered, they lost someone, or they are in terrible psychological condition or material difficulty. But something that a friend of mine who is a journalist say, we can't talk about that in the press, is that half or slightly more than half had actually a very positive experience. They say we reconnect with our dear ones. Everybody speaks of slow down, we slow down. We had reconnection with nature if we were in nature. And so they felt that was actually something. And I think also the teaching. When you speak of suffering and tragedy, I mean, when the plague was there in the Middle Age, when in the 20th century, 400 million people died of smallpox. I mean, there has been, in France, the life expectancy in 1900 was 47 years old. I mean, things have changed with suffering. We have seen suffering. I work with this humanitarian organization that I started, Carbon Association, in India and Nepal. Well, there's earthquake, there's floods, there's anything you can imagine. So people know suffering. So in a way, of course, it's an alarm bell. And one of the reason of this teaching we can get from this pandemic, in my mind, in terms of happiness and suffering, is we have seen that government, at least most of them, have been able to take drastic decisions and most people ready to follow. So you would think that if only half of that determination was put at the service of the greatest challenge of the 21st century, which is the environment, and people would follow, that we can get somewhere. That's one thing. The second alarm bell, which I think is very important, is if you look at all the virus infection for the last 30 years, starting from AIDS, Ebola, swine flu, bird flu, SARS, and this one, they all come from unbalanced relation with other species, either with wild species like AIDS and Ebola and so forth, or within the industrial farming. So all that is, again, this sort of, we are not able to have a sustainable harmony with our environment. So all those are lessons that we can possibly take and go to build up a better world together. So that's a way of flourishing together.
Right. But I think that a lot of people feel right now that in order to do what you say, to reassert balance, and to address the injustices of the world, it's not simply appropriate to be angry, it's necessary. That anger is going to be the engine that pushes forward change. And so on some level, I could imagine someone hearing us talk and thinking, well, to take the position that I can be happy amidst all of these horrible injustices, that could feel like a resignation of a way, a dereliction of duty on some level. I wonder what how you would respond to that.
Not at all, not at all. Because again, it's thinking of happiness, feeling that is fine. I enjoy that. Again, if we look at happiness as a way of being with compassion, courage, determination, it's nothing to do with feeling good again. And I think personally that the main core component of happiness is altruism, more consideration for others. There's no such thing as a successful selfish happiness. It's a lose-lose situation. You make yourself miserable and make everyone miserable. So if we take as altruistic love and compassion as the core component of flourishing, then we are really onto something. Because if you look at the challenges of the 21st century, one of the main ones is to reconcile the short-term needs, like a mother in Africa needs to feed their kids, or the short-term interest of a investor of the stock market who needs the 1 month something. Then there is the midterm, how we do flourish in life, a career, a generation, a family, a lifetime, and the pursuit of flourishing, having a good life, fulfill our legitimate aspiration. No, we cannot. We have to have this right to pursue our aspiration. That is a new challenge that was not there 12,000 years ago when we were 5 million humans on Earth, which is now we became the major force that shapes the planet. We enter the Anthropocene. So we are shaping the fate and the suffering of happiness of future generations. Now you put environmental scientists with policy makers, with investors, with social workers, with farmers in Africa around the table, and it's a schizophrenic dialogue. They don't speak of the same time scale, and so forth. So now we need a concept, a unifying concept to work together. And having more consideration for others is the only one that works. It's very pragmatic. If you have that, in the short term, you have more caring economics, where economy is at the service of people and of society and not the opposite. More solidarity, not just like this incredibly, aspiration of all the wealth on the top or on the hands of 20 or 30 people. If you have a consideration for others, you will make social policy that makes a better workplace, more social justice, less free riders. You provide the condition for people to flourish. You don't tell them how to be happy, but you provide the condition. And if you have more consideration for others, you are not going to jeopardize the fate of future generation. Otherwise, they'll say you knew and you did nothing. So here you have a concept that is at the heart of happiness, and there's the most pragmatic, like Ariane thread, to connect all those three time scales and work together for a better world. And it's not a luxury, it's not utopian, it's very pragmatic. Martin Luther King said, we came on different boats, now we're all on the same vessel. So cooperation is the only possibility. The other law of the jungle is cooperation. And it has been much more creative throughout evolution than competition, contrary to what some people might think.
I love that. Pragmatic is a great word, because I wonder, I'd like to ask you about the science, your work with science over the years. But first, I can't help but wonder if you feel, as you said very strongly just now, that altruism and compassion are the core. Take somebody like me who just started meditating literally 2 weeks ago. I'm brand new. Somebody who's really tiptoeing their way into taking seriously for the first time, like how do we get inner peace, all of the things that you're saying. What's the first step? I mean, is it to go out, walk out into the street and do a nice thing for somebody else? Like if there's one thing to do that's pragmatic, what would you recommend?
Well, first of all, when you said you started 2 weeks ago, so you have to be patient. You see, you learn how to read and write. You learn the skills, professional skills that make you what you are, And chess player, piano artist who play the piano, everyone has learned something over time with determination, with the perseverance, and those changes come with time and with practice. So it will be a complete mystery if some of those basic human qualities would be right at the top from the beginning, or will be given by our genetic inheritance, and that, as we know, we cannot change anything, which is not true, because we know that with epigenetics, we know with neuroplasticity that we can change. It just needs training on the right thing. So just as you learn to sing, to play the piano, to play badminton, to play football, chess, we can start from what is given to us by nature in terms of altruism, in terms of concentration, attention, emotional balance, all those qualities which I mentioned in the beginning, wherever they are in yourself, with your own, inclination, tendencies. We are all different, mixed. Some people are more kind naturally, some not, some may be angry, some may be jealous. But anyway, that's our starting point. But every of those, and we know that for true with neuroscience and epigenetics, can start from a certain point and be brought to a more optimal point. Everything can change. We know that. So it just needs to practice the right thing. So meditation, usually you need as a tool. Meditation means mind training, but you're training your mind. And why not training our mind? We train our mind all the time for all kinds of things. But here we will train them for human qualities, attention, mindfulness, compassion, and those are trainable, those are skills. And neuroscience has shown that many times. I've been involved in neuroscience research for 20 years, and epigenetics tells you also you can change the expression of your genes by what you do and what you do with your mind, what you do with your body. So this is a way to become a better person, to live in a more optimal way for yourself and for others. So the twofold benefit of others and yourself can be accomplished by bringing those qualities at their best point according to your own capacity. Not everyone will be an Olympic champion, but we all have a huge margin of change.
Okay, so let's talk about, you just mentioned 20 years you've been working with scientists, and in our pregame chat, you mentioned that you were doing a webinar with the Dalai Lama celebrating 20 years of scientists studying meditators. And during that time, I think you said you have been stuck in an MRI, you have been subjected to extreme heat, extreme noise, shocks, I don't know what else. Can you complete that list for me? And like what had they done to you, these scientists? And through that 2 decades, what have you learned? What have they learned?
Well, those scientists are some of my best friends. I mean, it's a wonderful community. No, there's an institute called the Mind and Life Institute that was actually founded more than 30 years ago, knowing that the Dalai Lama had a very, very strong interest in science. He said if he had not been Dalai Lama, I would have been an engineer or something. So there's a great neuroscientist called Francisco Varela. He was Chilean born, but he was in Harvard and in France. And Adam Engel, who was a businessman and a lawyer. They thought to start this organization to facilitate meeting of the Dalai Lama with the greatest scientists of our time. In the beginning, it was looked like giving the best tutors you can imagine. But very soon, it appears that the Dalai Lama has a very incisive mind. And those meetings were actually very good for both the scientists and the Dalai Lama. So I came in the year 2000 in one of the groundbreaking meetings that was on destructive emotions. So there was Paul Ekman, Francisco Varela, Richard Davidson, Daniel Goleman, John Kabat-Zinn, and others. So at some point in the week, this usually typically lasts 5 days, the Dalai Lama said, well, it's all great what we're discussing, but what can we contribute to society? So then came the idea of, bringing the best scientists and some experienced meditators and see if mind training was just like, you just imagine that you're changing, or if there's real change that can be seen, through the means of investigation of science has now with fMRI and EEG and all kinds of things, now even at the level of the genes and telomeres and all that. So then, as an ex-scientist, I imprudently volunteered to be a guinea pig and participate. But soon it turned out that the guinea pig has to be also a collaborator. When you study, say, you want to study the effect of compassion on the brain. So do you need to warm up for half an hour, or can you get into the state in 15 seconds? So that makes a huge difference into designing the experimental protocol. So basically, we're also collaborator. And then when you get the analysis of the data, the first person experience, what did you actually felt when you were generating this mental state and you see activation in certain areas of the brain? Why? Why, for instance, when you meditate on compassion, the motor area of the brain is activated? So the meditator said, well, because compassion is a readiness to act for alleviating the suffering of others. So it makes sense. So you see, the first person report also is very important to interpret the results. So anyway, to the extent that to show that, one of the first paper that was published, Richard Davidson insisted that the meditator be a co-author because we really designed all that together. So all over the years, yes, we try to see if we can increase attention, how can we grow more compassion, what happens if can a meditator control the startle experience, the startle that you have when there's a loud noise next to you, you have a different reaction to pain. So you mentioned pain. That's why I was put extreme heat on my wrist or electric shocks, because normally when someone knows he's going to have pain, the brain gets all over the place even before anticipation. You see the activation of the brain, of the pain network before the pain is actually there, full-fledged. And after the pain, there's a lot of aftershocks. So what we found with the meditators is that they stay perfectly fine until the sharp pain comes. They don't fret about before. Then they feel the pain very sharp, but they are not too disturbed emotionally. And as soon as it's gone, they come back completely to their baseline without all these aftershocks and emotional upheavals. So this is the kind of things that we were studying. Then we also found that if we have a unconditional compassion and loving kindness, the subjective experience of pain is much less. And not only that, but you register less activation of brain networks. So all these things are really wonderful. It's a kind of new field of so-called contemplative neuroscience. So we could show, for instance, in Germany with Tanya Singer, the difference between empathy and compassion, and show that in medicine we speak of compassion fatigue, but we found that there's no compassion fatigue, there's empathy fatigue. There's the empathic distress that leads to emotional burnout and exhaustion, but compassion replenish. It's like a balm on the burnout. So all this we could see even in the brain, different networks activated with empathic distress and with compassion. So all this is wonderful, and that had a lot of repercussion in social work. Now in France, we are doing a program with those people who work with the migrants and the homeless and in hospital where they have a lot of burnout, to equip them by training their mind to more to this warmth, the good heart, the loving kindness as an antidote to empathic distress and burnout. So this is really exciting and interesting.
That's cool. That's really interesting. We're just getting into the last few minutes of you and I's conversation. We're going to bring in the audience, but I want to zoom in, and my mind was going pop, 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 pop as you were talking. I want to zoom in on just one small thing that you mentioned. First of all, that's fascinating about the idea that compassion connects to the motor parts of your brain, but then as you articulated, makes so much sense. But on that difference between compassion and empathy, can you model for us what is the difference
Yes.
if you are a care provider of some kind?
Yeah, of course. So, I went to work with Tanya Singer, who is one of the world specialists on empathy. So empathy, there are two kinds. Affective empathy, you're very joyful, you smile, I smile, even I don't know why. If I come to a conversation where everybody is laughing and smiling, I smile. So it's affective resonance. If someone is suffering, Tanya Singer showed that you are really suffering because of that suffering. It's not fake. In the brain, you see the suffering networks activated if you see a dear person in pain. So it's real. It's an affective resonance. There's a cognitive empathy. I might be sitting next to someone in the plane who is panicked by aeroplanes, and I love it, but so I can know that she's affected, the person, and I can do something. So that's cognitive empathy. So now the problem with affective empathy is an alarm bell. It allows us to know the condition of others. Psychopaths typically don't feel empathy, so they cut people in pieces. They think it's great. So now, if your job as a caregiver, as a nurse, as a social worker is to day after day resonate affectively with suffering, and actually empathy is the effect it has on you. It's the effect of suffering has on you. So it increased the burden hour after hour, day after day. So it's too much. So you have overwhelmed and you fall into burnout and empathic distress. So what we found is Tanya asked me to meditate on compassion, and she's used to see empathy in the brain. So when I was in the fMRI, and she was real-time fMRI, she said, "What are you doing? This is not the networks of empathy." I said, "Well, it's compassion." She said, "What's that?" So we start discussing, and she said, "Can you only do empathy?" So I thought of a documentary I seen on the BBC about Romanian orphans who were in a terrible condition. And I empathized with that again and again for an hour in the fMRI, and I completely burned out within an hour. So then she said, now you can switch to compassion, which is like a very warm, every atom of the suffering is pervaded with atom of love, is caring, is stuffing, like how do I deal with this child who is bleeding and all that. So it's embracing, it's caring, it's loving, and actually completely changing the brain in my own experience. And we found that it's actually replenishing your strength, your core, because it's other-oriented. So Tanya did also a study where she asked people to only do empathy for a week and only do compassion. And people who only do empathy, they were really in trouble after a week. They were crying in the tramway coming to the lab because they saw suffering everywhere. So they had to rescue them. So she did a longitudinal study of 9 months, 3 months of mindfulness meditation, 3 months of perspective taking, cognitive empathy, and 3 months of loving kindness. And she found that loving kindness increased prosocial behavior, increase your resilience, increase your faculty to deal with the suffering of others in constructive way, reduce the burnout. So this was also, for a meditator, something I've not thought about. The word empathy is quite specific. I don't have a Buddhist equivalent necessarily. So this is one of the things that I discovered while interacting with the science. It is very important distinction between empathy and compassion. So there's empathy, standalone empathy is like a water pump without water. It burns. If you bring the water of compassion, then it doesn't burn. It actually gives you strength. So that's, I think, a very beautiful thing, and it can be used, especially in the care system, where in the US, I think 60% of caring personnel are or will suffer of burnout.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's amazing. I guess should I keep going, or Margaret?
I hope people can hear me. We have, several hundred people joining us this afternoon, and many, many, many interesting questions. So, Mathieu, if this is okay with you, I will pick a few. We don't have a lot of time left, particularly those that I think you haven't addressed in your remarks so far. So one of our guests wonders, Mathieu, if you can put in words how happy would look like in a photograph for you.
How what? Happiness would look in a photograph?
Yeah, for you.
Any photograph.
Any photograph.
Well, I did a book, but it's not in English, on wonderment, awe. And I think that's awe is a lot to do with a sense of flourishing. Because when you feel wonderment in front of the beauty of nature, or the smile of a child, or even of a toothless old guy somewhere in the Himalayas, the beauty of human nature, and you wonder how beautiful people are, but they don't know necessarily, but how beautiful nature is. So that some studies have shown that when you feel this awe, you become also more altruistic and happier, because it's something bigger than yourself. The sense of me, excessive self-centeredness sort of dissolves. So that's a factor that's quite important for feeling the sense of fulfillment and happiness. So in a way, a photograph that elicits awe and wonderment for me will be connected with all the good aspects of happiness. But of course, a radiant face, smiling with the eyes and everything full of love, that's the best of all.
Yeah, that's a lovely image, and one that makes me think of the young people who come to our museum, where, you often see wonderment on their faces as they're experiencing different kinds of things. And it's deeply compelling. So a very different kind of question is asked here. And this question goes, we think that physical discomfort or pain is a warning, of course, for something that needs to be attended to. Is unhappiness the same kind of warning?
Well, when Jad mentioned about the Buddha speaking about suffering, well, yes, if we look at most of, our usual preoccupation, gain and loss, pleasure and pain, fame and obscurity, blame and praise, all that are source of endless frustration. So if you feel frustrated, there may be something wrong in the system, I would say, or your worldview. Mm-hmm. Because if you can only think that you'll be happy if you got that much of that, this much of this, and then, it's like trying to win the lottery. Those things will never happen that way. While if you cultivate, I remember being once with one of my teachers, a Tibetan teacher. He was invited to Tahiti by sort of coincidence. And we were sitting in the place where we were hosted. There was a beautiful swimming pool lighted at night, and all the birds were singing this paradisiac tropical landscape. And we thought, okay, now what will bring happiness in that? Is it the swimming pool? So that means it's twice as big, we'll be twice as happy, and we start giggling and laughing. So basically, again, I think it's really a state of mind, and that allows us to to the ups and downs of life, even sadness, the difficulties, the dramas, the beauty, the wonderment, the tragic things that happen, with the strength of mind, with freedom. We are not overwhelmed with anger, resentment, jealousy, and all that, or greed. So inner freedom, and basically a benevolent mind. I think good heart, my religion is that of good heart. That really takes care of almost everything. And I think that can be cultivated when people are more or less gifted with it. So yes, I think in that way, I think we can go about this complex world and, resolving conflict. The best way is to be ready to dialogue, to make concession, to try to see the perspective of others. All that comes from benevolence. So from all aspects, at least you keep your own dignity. That's the best approach. It may not work with some people, but at least you have done the best you could. You have no regret. You didn't fall into the escalation of violence and conflict and replying and fighting back, all these things that create endless sufferings. So there is ways to navigate in this complex world, guided with some kind of discernment and mostly with benevolence, and that to do the best we can.
And one last question. How are you finding happiness these days, particularly when all of us are kind of living at a bit of a distance from one another and interacting through mediums like this, Zoom or YouTube or webinars, and we are kind of missing that more intimate human connection?
Yeah, we become a bit like zombies, as a friend of mine would say.
Zombies, exactly.
But I think, you always, even though I used to live alone in mountains, Hermitage and all that, but we still have a few good friends around. We are not completely alone. Right. So in fact, for me, this, what people call social life, if it's this glittering social life of entertainment and going endlessly to restaurants and things like that, I'm already trying to get out of it for a long time ago. So this is not what I'm missing for sure. Now, the depth of social connectedness and friendship, and I think is still there very much. And even sometimes when I'm alone in my Hermitage, it's not like, loneliness is very detrimental to mental and physical health. And many studies have shown that. It reduces your life expectation. There's so many incredible work done on loneliness that I've discovered more recently, thanks to some scientist friends. But there's also an aspect of not loneliness, but a voluntary solitude, finding yourself in a beautiful environment and trying to become a better person. So building up the strength so that you can be better at the service of others. And when I'm spending time in my Hermitage, I try to build also the determination to be of service through the humanitarian projects. Now, Karuna Sechen organization, we are helping more than 300,000 people every year in India, Nepal, and Tibet on social services, health, education. So somehow we build the strength for that by trying to improve those human qualities and then putting them at the service of others. Otherwise, you might have good intention, but you're a little bit like a beggar who wants to give a banquet to other beggars. We don't have to give. And we see in many humanitarian organizations, what brings them down is not so much that there's nothing to do or no resources. It's conflict of ego, corruption, basically human shortcomings. So if you try to have a vision of trying, as you help others to become a better human being, then you have a better chance of success, I think.
Thank you. I love the image of kind of compassion as a kind of fuel that feeds us all rather than depletes it. And I think that's what you're sharing with us. Jad and Mathieu, we are at the end of our time. I can't thank you both enough. This was a fascinating conversation. Jad, as always, you are an extraordinarily talented thinker and interviewer. And Mathieu, we are so honored that you joined us today. Your work it's important for all of us, and especially for kind of the well-being of the human soul. So we thank you for that.
Thank you, Margaret, and thank you, Jad. It was lovely to meet both of you and all others who are here.
We hope you will all come to visit us
Yes, why not?
when the museum reopens, and come see the happiness experiment.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Right. Thank you
Take
so
care.
much.
Thank you,
everyone.
everybody. Bye.
Bye-bye.